I'm here in the heart of Birmingham, Alabama, and just across the way is the 16th Street Baptist Church, where on the 15th of September 1963, Ku Klux Klan members came and decided to blow it up. And inside the church, 4 girls died. Later, Martin Luther King led a march down these streets. They were met with water cannons and dogs, and here in the park there's memorials to remember what had happened then. But I'm thinking about those who have been forgotten, those Africans who weren't taken west to the Americas and to the Caribbean, but those Africans that were taken east into Arab lands. It's interesting that just before the start of the transatlantic slave trade in the 15th century, we see attitudes against black Africans, negative attitudes coming out of Arabia. We see Islamic scholars like Ibn Khaldun say that the Negro nations are submissive to slavery. We see other Islamic scholars like Ibn Sina, Melchizedek. We see other scholars like Al-Tabari talking about the superiority of the Arabs. We can trace actually the negative views on black people coming out of Arabia from the 15th to the 14th to the 13th to the 12th and the 9th century. In fact, scholars such as Bernard Lewis, who recently passed, has said that immediately after the death of Muhammad, we see something changing in terms of colour. You see, before the 7th century, colour was fluid. You wouldn't have black people or white people. You would have people saying, for example, I am white in contrast to this bench, or I'm black in contrast to the grey slabs. Colour was fluid. You would determine your colour by contrasting it with what was around you. But something happened in the 7th century that started to fix colour and specialise colour. And with it, there were characteristics attached to the colour. And in the case of black people, there were negative connotations to that. We also see in the 7th and 8th century, straight after Islam started, we see black people being described as Banu Ham, sons of Ham, and a reference was made back to the Torah, talking about the curse of Ham. It was a curse of blackness, they say, and they linked blackness with slavery. In fact, there isn't a curse of Ham in the Bible, there's a curse of Canaan, and it doesn't relate to the black people. But this is how it was interpreted in Islamic literature, so that Africa became a place where they would get slaves thinking that this was the curse that Allah put on them. Scholars like Dr. John Azuma said that the black people were given the hardest and meanest work in places like Iran, where they had 500 to 5,000 people working on the soil in really difficult conditions. And so the negative attitudes to black people didn't start with the transatlantic slave trade. It was right there before, in the trans-Saharan slave trade. This slave trade went on from the 7th century all the way up until the 21st century or the 20th century. We know that the last Arab nation, or the last nation to stop their slavery, was Mauritania in 1981. But yet last week I was in the Gambia and I heard reports of slaves working down the road belonging to Arab shopkeepers. So we know this is still going on. So whilst we still see the consequences of the transatlantic slave trade in the West and in other places, we see the legacy, we see monuments. People are making an active decision to remember and so not to repeat the mistakes of the past. But what do we find with the trans-Saharan slavery? We haven't seen one Arab nation apologise for what they did in Africa or in Europe or in India or in Asia. We haven't seen that at all. We haven't seen any monuments put up in any Arab countries. We haven't actually seen any anti-slavery movements take place. In fact, it was the British and then along other countries that forced Arab nations to stop their slave trade. It wouldn't have stopped otherwise. There's something in Christianity that acknowledges the sanctity of man because he's made in the image of God. Do we see that in the trans-Saharan slave trade? No. Because in Islam, man is not made in the image of God. In Islam, the highest status you can be is a slave. That's the highest way you can relate to Allah. He is God, you are the slave. In Christianity, we're called sons, we're called daughters. There's a relationship that can be developed, not so in Islam. Further, in Islam, you can have slaves. It's within the laws. This was one of the fights against abolition. Allah has guaranteed that you can have slaves in the right conditions. They have to be spoils of war or, passed down, inherited to you, but you can actually have slaves. And so who is anybody to say that you shouldn't have slaves? This is still the attitude in some cases, which explains why it took so long for the trans-Saharan slave trade to stop. But the question is, we know this now. Why is no one talking about it? Why is it not taught in schools? Why are we concentrating on one trade, as horrific as it was, but not also looking at the other trade, which was equally as horrific, and due to the length of time still continuing, could even be described as more horrific? So the question is this: why are the slaves that went east forgotten? Why are we not talking about this?